she's gotten very little sleep. So I told her that I would be glad to take over in the teaching today. But we both asked Louis if he would do the opening and the closing. So, or at least the opening. So Louis, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you, Louis.
Yeah, thank you so much. So welcome to our first session for Spirit and the Movies Part 2, our summer session. This class is going to take place every Wednesday at noon from today, April 27th to June 8th. I believe I see a bunch of familiar faces, so I don't think anyone has not experienced our Spirit in the Movies 1 class. So it's going to be the same format as our previous sessions. What's going to happen during our sessions is we're going to watch the trailers for 2 films, and then we're going to watch the trailer for 1 film, and then we're going to discuss that film. We're going to discuss how that film fits into our sort of spiritual life, what we got from it, what we want to get from it, and then we're going to watch the trailer for our second film, have a discussion, and then we're going to close out. This is really a student-led class, so what I would really like to see is folks sending us movies that they want to discuss throughout the semester, so that way we can take a look at some of your favorite films and films that speak to your spirituality. Same as last semester, our class is co-sponsored by Process and Faith and Spirituality and Practice, sponsored by the Interfaith Center. And I believe we're going to start off our first movie. We're going to be doing a movie. Jay, do you want to do A Yak in the Classroom first, or did you want to do?
Actually, I'd like to do Wendell Berry first.
Okay, excellent. We're going to start off with the documentary that we sent, Wait and See, and we'll go ahead and get started with that. I'm going to go ahead and, Jay, if it's okay with you, play either the trailer or the start of the movie. Which would you prefer?
Yeah, the start of the movie. Let me say just a word first.
Yes, absolutely.
I chose 2 films today, and I don't presume that anybody's gotten to see them. And that's fine, but I have, and they really affected me. And one is a documentary of the poet farmer Wendell Berry, who lives in Kentucky, and he's kind of been the visionary behind a lot of the local food movement and environmental movements and sustainability movements. He's a remarkable human being. And there's a documentary on him called Look and See. And I'd heard about it, but I finally got to watch it for our class. And then we're going to see one called Lunana. It's about a small town in Bhutan. And so that'll be second, but let's start with Wendell Berry. And I asked Louis if we could watch the first part of the movie itself rather than the trailer. There's a poem, and he's reading it, and it'll set the tone for today. Ready, Louis? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, can everyone hear that okay?
No.
Okay, sorry, let me fix that real quick. All right.
Even while I dreamed, I prayed that what I saw was only fear and no foretelling. For I saw the last known landscape destroyed for the sake of the objective, the soil bulldozed, the rock blasted. Those who had wanted to go home would never get there now. I visited the offices where, for the sake of the objective, the planners planned, at blank desks set in rows. I visited the loud factories where the machines were made that would drive ever forward toward the objective. I saw the forest reduced to stumps and gullies. I saw the poisoned river, the mountain cast into the valley. I came to the city that nobody recognized because it looked like every other city. I saw the passages worn by the unnumbered footfalls of those whose eyes were fixed upon the objective. Men and women and children now pursued the objective as if nobody ever had pursued it before. The races and the sexes now intermingled perfectly in pursuit of the objective. The once enslaved, the once oppressed were now free to sell themselves to the highest bidder and to enter the best-paying prisons in pursuit of the objective, which was the destruction of all enemies, which was the destruction of all obstacles, which was to clear the way to victory, which was to clear the way to promotion, to salvation, to progress, to the completed sale, to the signature on the contract, which was to clear the way to self-realization, to self-creation, from which nobody who ever wanted to go home would ever get there now. For every remembered place had been displaced, every love unloved, every vow unsworn, every work unmeant, to make way for the passage of the crowd, of the individuated, the autonomous, the self-actuated, the homeless, with their many eyes opened only toward the objective, which they did not yet perceive in the far distance, having never known where they were going, having never known where they came from.
And Louis, I think you can show just about another minute or so.
Okay.
That's fine. So let me ask you, I'm going to put it on gallery view. Is anyone familiar with the work of Wendell Berry? Would you raise your hand if you are? So Greg, you are, and Carol, you are, and Janet, you are. That's great. Greg, what was the context in which you learned about Wendell Berry?
First got exposed to him in ethics class in seminary, where we were the subject was talking about sort of creation care and his ethical approach. I've subsequently found him just rediscovered. The Unsettling of America is prophetic. and feels very much of the moment. And he's just, I'm sitting literally surrounded by his books. So,
Are you?
yeah, just I grew up in southern Indiana near Louisville, Kentucky. So I know his land. And that connection to the land is really powerful.
And Carol, how about you? What was the context?
As a poet, my experience Wendell Berry as a poet. And so this film intrigues me because it's visual and we get to see what he sees and not a translation into language, but into actual joining with him and being on the land and of the land. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I look forward to seeing the film. I haven't yet.
Oh, it's so moving. It's so good. Anybody else familiar with him? I just trying to get a sense for where people are coming from. Janet, did you say you had?
Well, I have read one of his fiction books, and sadly, I can't remember the name of it, but that's about all I know about him. So I don't know a lot.
When I first moved to Arkansas, more than 40 years ago, I had heard that there was a group of people living in the foothills of the Ozarks that were trying to start a sustainable farm and try to show that you could live close to the land and on the earth in a responsible way, in a caring way, in a fun way, in a hardworking way that could be a model for a lot of people. And the place was called the Meadow Creek Project. And it was in Fox, Arkansas, which is one of the poorest counties in the state of Arkansas. And so I drove up there one day because I was interested in those things because I had gone to seminary and learned about this movement of recovering a sense of place. And I found the folks that lived there were remarkable people, and they were all shaped by the thought of Wendell Berry. Every single one of them. And Wendell Berry was their hero. And this place became an education center, and it linked up with colleges and universities, including Hendrix College, where I taught. And the Meadow Creek Project, the leader was a man named David Orr, O-R-R, it brought in speakers right and left. And one of the people that it brought in was Wendell Berry. And so I drove up there and got to know him and a little bit and brought him down to Hendrix to read some poetry. Took him to the airport and had my copy of The Unsettling of America in my hand. And I said, Mr. Berry, would you mind signing my book? And he signed my book. And I remember what he put. It was nothing. I'm building this up a little too much. He just said, with several thanks, comma, Wendell Berry. And that was his way of thanking me for hosting him. But I thought, several thanks. I don't think I've ever heard anyone use that phrase, several thanks. And I knew he was a poet, which he was. He was also a farmer. And if you know his story, he grew up in Kentucky on a farm that had been owned by many generations, a small farm. And he loved it, but then I forget where he went to school, but I think he ended up at Stanford actually, and got a degree in literature and was was known as a writer. And then he got a job in New York. And he worked in New York for a while. And there was something missing. And he went back to Kentucky. And in those days, if you're a writer, if you're going to make it in that literary scene, you don't go back to a farm in Kentucky. You stay in New York where the action is, or you build upon your connections at Stanford, where you're meeting so many fantastic people. But he moved back to Kentucky. And he decided he did not want to be a writer, except also a farmer. And he wanted to combine hands and the hard work and that sense of community with his vocation as a writer. And so he lived there and he started writing essays and poetry and books, and he wrote a book called The Unsettling of America, which Greg read. And it's a series of essays on how Western Europeans came to America and truly did unsettle it and brought a mindset, an attitude toward life that destroyed so much of the already existing ways on this continent. And that attitude toward life was one of conquest and exploitation and success measured in terms of money and achievement. But there were pockets, people learned to farm this country on small farms, and Wendell Berry thought they at least tried to opt out of that conquest mentality a little bit because they had to work with the land. They had to have a sense of nurturance. Life could not simply be about upward mobility and moving from one place to another. Life has to be being in place and having a sense of place and sense of belonging to a place and to a local community. A local community. So that book shaped many, many people. He's written many things since then. He's a great poet. He's a real character as a person. And it spawned what people call the bioregional movement. And the bioregional movement is a movement of people like you and me who say, I want to live in a local place. I want to be bonded to a local place. I want to make my peace with the local place. I don't want to be about moving to the higher level. I don't want to be about moving from place to place. I don't want to be about finding the perfect place. I want to live in a place and be loyal to that place and loyal to that community. Well, the bioregional movement is where you get the idea of locally grown food. And I bet wherever you are, many of you are in Arkansas or Missouri, you're aware of the locally grown food movement. You're aware of if you're in Little Rock, the Roots Cafe in Little Rock and that whole philosophy of life. That's Wendell Berry influenced. A lot more is Wendell Berry influenced, but that is. So 5 themes emerge with this documentary on him and actually his life work. And I just want to lift them up and then let's just talk about them. The first is the theme of forgotten roots. He feels like the forms of living of small farms in this country gave him a sense of roots. And they've kind of been forgotten and neglected by the dominant culture, by the upward mobility culture, by the always in a hurry culture, by the achievement culture. And so the documentary is a description of people that are trying to make a living in small farms in Kentucky, including Wendell Berry. And it tells their stories. And when you hear them speak, it actually gave me new eyes, and it might you if you watch it. Actually, it gave me new eyes for people that may have voted for Donald Trump. And I don't want to press buttons. I don't want to talk politics, but I do want to understand rural life and salt of the earth people in rural life that are understandably angry at an elitist culture that thinks they're nobodies and nothings. And you meet these people and you hear their stories and you just can't help but like them. But they feel like they're left behind. A second theme that emerged on it is the idea of, I'll call it a spirituality of stopping. You know, so much of life is about moving on, adventure, new place, higher, let me climb the ladder of success. I will move to any location. I will move away from my parents for the sake of upward mobility. And Wendell Berry is just saying a wholesale no to that. He's saying that authentic spirituality lies in living in place. He gets the phrase stopping from Gary Snyder. Maybe you know Gary Snyder too. Somebody asked Gary Snyder, what should we do? And Gary Snyder, the great poet, Buddhist influenced person, said, the most important thing to do is to learn to stop. Stop. Stop always feeling like we have to move some better place. A third theme is that spirituality lies in living in place and knowing your place and caring for your place and its people and its community. In physical place, not just cultural place, physical place. The land, the landscapes, the flora, the fauna, the birds, the rivers. By the way, I'm speaking to you now from Bentonville, Arkansas, and I've just been at Crystal Bridges Museum. This whole museum is trying to help people connect art in a sense of place. The outdoor gardens are absolutely as beautiful and marvelous as anything you'll find inside. I was going to name some more things, but I think I'll just stop there. I've talked a little too much already. So let's go back to forgotten roots. Do you have a sense that something important in your life that has to do with place, not people alone, place, has been forgotten and needs to be remembered and reclaimed? Would anybody like to speak to that? What is the place and what were the roots that have been forgotten? What's your version of Wendell Berry's farm in Kentucky?
It's not as close as Wendell Berry's farming community, but there's one particular hike that I've been on over the past 40 years, and I've been there in different seasons of the year and different seasons of my life, and I always love seeing it again. And oh, I remember that rock. I remember that tree.
Yeah.
I remember this panoramic view. It's very rejuvenating to revisit that place literally and in memory.
I got it.
It's one of those places. It's the place, not the people. I've been there with different people.
So I would like to ask, that's a kind of solitary experience. Is that right? I mean, it's you in that place.
Well, and the different people I've been there with too.
Yeah. Was there a community associated with that place that you also felt bonded to?
A little bit.
Uh-huh.
A friend told me you go down this dirt road and turn at the gravel pit to find it.
That's the beginning of a community. That's called a friend. I think it begins there. Anybody else, a place in your past somehow associated with a community of people that you love and you feel affection for, but that's kind of been neglected or forgotten, represents a different life than yours now? Anybody else? Greg?
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier. The small town I grew up, 5,000 people in southern Indiana. About a year ago, a dear friend from those times reached out to me to connect. He had stayed in this town called Mitchell, and was a barber there, had built his business. And after losing his job because it got outsourced to another country, he's of a different political mindset. You alluded to that, Jay, but also I've developed a great affection and understanding of how he is thinking. And we speak every Monday. We try to. And you know, we are increasingly getting into areas that are make both of us nervous, but also tighten our connection. So I see him as the person who stayed, and I'm the person who left. But yet we are trying to connect. The town that I refer to, like many small towns, you know, all across, has, you know, basically emptied out, lost population, lost industry. May be seeing a bit of a turnaround right now, but maybe too late.
Greg, I think that phrase, the person who stayed, Wendell Berry would really get that. Carol.
Yeah, I have two places, but I was really reluctant at first to speak up, as though the only land that really matters is the rural land, you know, the idealized rural land. And I'm a New Yorker. And so the forgotten place for me only recently come to mind again is New York and Jerusalem, two very densely populated, intense places, multicultural, rich in flavor, but not in landscape in the way that Wendell Berry opens our hearts to. So it was a shocker. It was a surprise to me to see what my landscape was. But the only thing I can say is that those were places I walked and I was physically engaging all the time with my surroundings. And the other places I've lived have been places that we drove to and, you know, from. So it's something about physically connecting and touch, and of course the people, the interaction and the memories of people in those spaces, particularly Jerusalem, very rich and diverse memories. But as I watched the opening scene of the movie, I felt like, oh, this is what I should be relating to. And of course, we all have rural memories. New York State is absolutely beautiful physically. The landscape is magnificent, especially in the mountains. But yeah, I guess I'm a city rat, and that came home in the recollections of landscape.
Yeah. I bet there are cityscapes.
Right.
That are very much part of your heart and mind. And I think your mentioning of the walking is very, very important. That's in the Wendell Berry mood, even if it's not rural. And a sense of bondedness. Do you have a sense of bondedness? And affection?
True affection, really.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in here on just remembered local places where you had a sense of bondedness to community and place?
Well, I've spent most of my life in Little Rock, and goodness, it has changed since the early 1950s a lot. But back when I was growing up, I mean, maybe this is just obviously a sign of the times, but people didn't lock their doors. The church didn't even lock their door. It just seemed like things were more secure and safe, and you didn't worry about your children if they went out to play for a couple hours and didn't come home till dark, that kind of thing, which probably all of us have experienced at some point in our life. But gosh, that was such a time of bonding for me with the neighborhood and the church and the community. And it just, the only word I can think of to really describe it is a real sense of security and safety, which unfortunately Little Rock doesn't have the reputation of now. And, you know, I know that's true in many, many situations across the United States, but boy, did I feel the closeness of a smaller population Little Rock, you know, experience. Real fond memories, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Tina. Hi, Lynn. Good to see you. We're on
hi. Good. I thought I tried to join and I used the old link, and then I found the email and realized, oh, good, y'all are meeting. Since we're talking about Little Rock, I'll pick up on that because I grew up in Little Rock, and when I was third grade, we moved into the house that my grandfather designed and my dad lived in about that same age. And one of the things about it, I've mentioned before that I had cancer as a teenager. And for me, when I was too weak to go anywhere else, and I would lie in the backyard, and it's right next to Allsop Park. For anybody that knows Little Rock, there's this large wooded area that was back behind our house. And a valley went down. So there were lots of hiking trails. And for me, just lying there in the backyard, it became a place of kind of healing, awakening and healing for me. And then Becca and I used to travel around all over in Europe and in Mexico too, in the United States. And I would often say, oh, this reminds me of Allsop Park. So there was this sense of home, and it had a lot to do with the nature, the sense of.
So let's turn to the theme of stopping just a little bit and rural values. I want to use Greg's metaphor of, not metaphor, actuality, the one who stayed. I did not, when I grew up, and I'm not sure about you, I grew up with parents who wanted me to be happy. And being happy meant being educated. And being educated meant being able to have a vocation that meant something to me. And that was such a given that it was never questioned that I would move on. So I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and I went to school in Tennessee and went to graduate school in California and teach in Arkansas. And it never would have occurred to me or to them to say, Jay, the best thing is to live within 20 miles of your parents. It's not about moving on. It's about being loyal to and part of a community that stays and lives in the thick and thin of the bonds, those profound bonds that can only be known in local community. Don't move on. Stay. The beauty is in the staying. That would have been a jolt to my parents, a jolt to me. I never would have agreed to it. That was alien. That was foreign. Stay? That's not what life's about. It's about moving. But I want to just ask, can you hear some truth in the spirituality of staying? Can you hear some wisdom in the spirituality of staying? And can you hear a critique of the idea that life's supposed to be about moving, finding a better place? This is kind of Greg's relationship with his barber friend in that town in Indiana. And so can we just for a moment put ourselves inside his skin and say, maybe he saw something we don't see. And maybe it's really important. So any thoughts on that? Anybody? Ellen.
I wonder if there is some kind of a parallel to the spirituality of returning. So that there's an expectation, I think, where there was, I grew up similarly to you in that there was an expectation that I would go out into the world and learn what there was to learn, but also that family was very important, and that once you make your way and you figure out what you want to do, come back and be part of who we are, because this is where you belong. And so that's kind of how I understand my parents' message to me, and my own message to my own kids actually was, I don't want you to just stay put. You need to experience more people, other ideas and all that. But it would be great if we all were together and, you know, came back, which of course hasn't happened, but, you know, in the ideal.
Yeah. Ellen, did you send that signal to them? I mean, I love the idea of spirituality of returning. That's beautiful. My children live in Providence, Rhode Island, in San Diego, California, way away. And I couldn't even say to them, by the way, the better way to live is to come to Conway, Arkansas, where you grew up, and we'll be family. You know, that's a foreign idea. Did you somehow manage to get that idea in your children?
Well, the kink in that for me is that I don't live where they grew up.
Okay.
So they grew up in St. Louis, and I moved here to be closer to one of my kids, because I have one in California and one who was in Tel Aviv. Now he lives in a different city, but in Israel. So it was an ideal that we would be all together in St. Louis, but that's not the reality of the situation. So I was the one who moved. And so I don't really have a sense of place here, and neither does my daughter who lives here. We reminisce about St. Louis, and, you know, if we could all be together, would we be there? So in practicality, I can't even answer that question.
Right.
Yeah, and I have 5 children in 5 different communities. And I had a big family because I wanted them to stay and to be in one location, deepening family in one location in Canada, which was where I was transplanted to. It was where our work took us. And that became our home community, and still is, in a sense, our nexus point. You know, it's the point where we came to new life and brought new life, and, you know, created family and developed community. And so now one child has returned there after we left to come to St. Louis. And so I guess our family legacy is still in Winnipeg, Canada, but the rest of us are dispersed.
Well, here we are, a mobile people.
Wandering.
Let's turn to one more theme, if we could. Wendell Berry, he talks about rural values and the goodness of some of them. He knows that rural life can be very parochial, and he knows that violent, mean-spirited. He doesn't hide from that. But he says, but there was some really good things about the farming community that I grew up with that I think the modern world really needs. Things like thriftiness, things like frugality, things like being able to do things with your hands, things like being able to fix things on your own, things like being able to amuse yourself without needing constant stimulation from the outside, things like trustworthiness. You know, you're a person of your word. And I think of that, and I think of my grandmother, and I bet you can think of your grandmother. My grandmother could make mango ice cream. I would not have the foggiest how to make ice cream, much less mango ice cream. And I sure would need a machine to help me. And so do you want to speak, do you have someone in your past that knew the arts of frugality, could do things, could make things in ways that you can't? And you kind of just admire that. And you know, Wendell Berry's also critical of, I mean, he's highly educated, but he's critical of only book-centered education, where we get a lot of ideas in our minds, but we can't fix things. We can't do things. We can't work with our hands. He's very critical of that. He thinks bodily work with the hands is noble work. All right. Anybody want to speak to the spirituality of frugality and can-do-itness? Ellen?
So my grandparents lived in Peoria, Illinois, which I saw as a very, it's not, but in my vision, it was a very rural, and you know, this is where you go to be in a small town. Peoria is the second largest town in the state of Illinois, but I didn't know that at that time. And to me, it was very rural, coming from Philadelphia and then from St. Louis. So we would go to this big house where my grandparents had an apartment. And my grandmother made her own donuts. My grandfather, so my grandparents were from Europe, and they were very frugal because they grew up, they didn't have anything. I mean, they didn't have anything. They used leaves and corn cobs in the outhouse. So, you know, they didn't have anything. So they thought coming to the United States and, you know, being able to earn a living, my grandfather was a carpet layer. And he was very proud. He was offered an opportunity to manage a furniture store. And he said, I don't want to do that. I want to work with my hands. And he drove a truck and he had tools. And we thought, oh my gosh, this is fantastic that he has these rough hands that are calloused and all that. You know, he could do all kinds of things. And his phrase that he always said to us in Yiddish was, "Midaf nicht," for what do you need it? So we would say, why don't you, you know, get a new suit or get any, "Midaf nicht, what do I need it for? I don't need it." He would be very generous with us, but for he and my grandmother, who never took a vacation, who never did anything like that, it was like, they're going to store it up for us and for their kids, but they don't need it. And that was a really important lesson. When my grandmother made her own donuts, we shouldn't go out and spend any money on donuts. I can make the donuts. We shouldn't go out and spend any money on this or that or the other thing. I can make it for you. And we were in awe of that. We would come for the summer and all of that was surrounding us. And then it was time to go back to the city, and that was okay. But I carry that with me, and my kids, of course, don't have that. And my grandkids, of course, don't have that either.
Hey, Ellen, say one more time the Yiddish phrase, please, for all of us.
Midaf nicht. What do I need it for?
But how would we spell that if we wanted to write that out?
Midaf nicht, I think, would be, I don't know, Carol, tell me. M-I-Midaf, D-A-F.
Near.
N-I-S-H-T. Midaf nicht.
That's
what do you need it?
It actually means we don't have to do it, really.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. But
this is really Wendell Berry-ish.
Could I say something?
Yeah.
I think because my parents were refugees, I don't know if Sophia's online, but you know, I didn't understand that refugees had a sense of how temporary everything is and how scarce things can be. So although, you know, we grew up, we had a nice apartment in New York City. My parents both worked, which was unusual for women in my generation to be at work. My mother was mostly at home, but had a part-time job. And the feeling was always things were sparse. They were just what we needed. And my mother had an expression, I think it was an English expression, though I never heard anybody else say it. She would say that my grandfather, who lived rather flamboyantly, he came over from Europe later than they did and had settled in England and had established himself a little bit more, but they came as refugees. She would say, don't put raisins in her head. Don't put these fanciful things in her eye, because he would indulge his grandchildren, right? And my mother really didn't want that, because the truth is that things are scarce, and to treasure what you have and not to lust after more. And I want to say that it came home to me, not through Wendell Berry so much, but when COVID started, I suddenly said to Neil, I think I've trained my whole life for this. Because the sense of sparsity, people were complaining about what they could get and couldn't get, but we had what we needed. And the sense of knowing that was very strong. And I really credit my parents for that. Knowing that things are temporary, that we only need what we need, that, there is such a thing as luxury and there is such a thing as basic needs, and they're distinct. And it was a lesson I didn't realize I had learned until the pandemic. So I guess that's the spirituality of the pandemic, the recognition that we have what we need and we can manage with what we have.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. Has anybody that's not spoken, did anybody want to say anything, share it, particularly if you've not been able to yet? No need to, but please do. Okay, anybody who's spoken and wants to share again, that's fine too. Lynn?
Yeah, I'll say my grandparents on both sides were very much from, two of the four anyway, or actually even more, but one was from Little Rock, and I think 7 generations, counting my great nephew from Little Rock. And they moved up from Old Washington right after the Civil War. So down from South Arkansas, when it was actually the capital for a while. And so my dad's still there at 93 years old. And he tells me stories. He's got friends, a few that are still alive, one that he remembers being in first grade with. And this woman who actually worked for the government and libraries around the world. So she traveled around the world and has come back and settled in Little Rock. So they have the common stories. But that's interesting. And then but that's Little Rock, the big city. But a lot of coming from my dad, coming out of the, born in 1929, a lot of sense of you make do with what you have.
Yeah.
It's very much a part of his life. But my grandparents on the other side were in Danville, Arkansas. And that first settled Irish came and settled there in the 1860s. There's a cemetery just 2 blocks from where my grandparents lived that had one generation O'Regan and the next generation Reagan. And that's right there in Danville. And then so my grandparents had their garden, and I remember cranking peach ice cream really well in the back, and all kinds of, snapping purple hull peas and doing all kinds of things that was part of that family. And it's been interesting, the changes over the years. Now my sister lives back in the house in Little Rock where my grandfather designed in the 40s. And he's married to a man from India. So he very much has picked up and moved. But they're very much about family too. His family is very much about family, although they're scattered all over the place.
I think the theme in Berry that we just need to be honest to him about is family and place, family and local place. And you've got that, Lynn. Many of us have that, but they were very much combined. And I so appreciate Carol's remark, well, how about an urban place? I think there's family and place there too. But we were going to see one more movie, but I'm looking at the clock and we've got about 10 minutes. So
we've got about 10 minutes. So I guess this is more of a question for you, Jay, and the class. Do we want to continue this discussion for another 10 minutes, or do we want to have a very short discussion about our next movie?
All in favor of continuing the discussion, say aye.
Aye.
All in favor of moving on to the next movie, say aye.
Oh no.
I abstained.
And there's an abstention. I suggest that we move on. It's okay. I'll make the executive decision, but we can always return to this because the next one's kind of about this too. So it's a little bit of a continuation. Is that okay with you, Sally? You were the vocal eye. I'm sorry. Sure. Yeah. Let's do it. Go ahead.
All right. We will start the next trailer.
Se show kabji thosa alu Lunana gi lobda di ngachi gi gya khab gi madowa zamling gya khab sugi lobda sugi tele thazu gi lobda chi chigi ngachi shiri lengka da chi ka la be di be lo shi ya sum te ya Lunana le lebe chi go be ngachi na lengka na lo yigo chi lide
lab china na pese de tenga tengora me na se
diwa chi gi luji mama ma besina chara ya sum shi
lam di la khayebo jamla lebe jile lebe gi la mazuru to besno ma
Machi Lunana gi mise suda marakatule lebe chemale suila lebe josu gi zimchi de na imela lebe chapsadi phachi kayu machi lobdo de diila
mana kadebe pechite na mashi ya na khishbu 마치 나도 야기 아오기 버면 fu고라 딩하기 되는 이러면 배 만나 그대배 배치됐네 마시 아마 준이 하자
칠레 딘디베 마치 알로솔로 시엔 덥수
Yaragila, good morning, Nobu.
야지기 경원입니다 야기 마치 Lunana로 스미 벤돌라
자차자냐
자차자냐 말로 뱀베고 놈이디 나전다 알로솔로 남잠 텐션이 되길라 레베 주바라마 제니도 티itengal라 레베 나가치데 치카미가야라
윈테니미 마치리지아캅 마음파이미 레베 나좀 지로 같이 마좀미디 같이 나모
What if you could get rid of your kitchen?
Was anybody able to see the movie? Anybody? Oh, what did you think, Joyce and Ellen? What did you think?
I loved this movie. It was beautiful and tender and very much in keeping, as you said, Jay, with this other movie, which I had not seen. I just, my curiosity about what did he do after the movie ended? And did he come back because he felt a connection to that place and to those people? And I thought that little girl was just fantastic. Oh my gosh.
Oh, she was, wasn't she? Joyce, how about you?
Yeah, I loved it too. I was very taken with the music in it and all the scenes, the remoteness of the village and how little those people had, yet how happy they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else anybody else see the movie besides Joyce and Ellen? Tina, what'd you think? Did you like it?
I didn't see it, but just from the trailer, I'm guessing, and that these children were exposed to a wonderful education. And one thing one reason I think that they were is that this young man taught from his heart and he taught from life experience at the same time, teaching them the rudimentaries of what they needed, but without all the in my opinion, unnecessary things that happen in public education here in our country with overuse of mandatory state tests and so forth. I saw on a Facebook page, a friend of mine posted that her third grader was so anxious over the state testing that he just almost got sick, and I thought, oh my gosh, but it's true. I think here there's not enough infinite emphasis on just teaching, you know, and not with all these assessments.
Let me frame the context. I think you're not supposed to give spoilers, but we're friends. He really didn't want to go to that village.
Yeah.
And he had his heart set on a career in music. He didn't want to be a teacher. And he ends up going to Australia. He wanted to go to Australia where he could make it. But he had one more year of service and he was appointed to go to that isolated village. And he didn't want to be there. He didn't want to use an outhouse. Half the time on his way up, he had earphones on listening to music because he could get the internet. And when he got there, he wanted to continue to use the internet and had his little cell phone, but they didn't have enough electricity from the solar powered whatever to do it. So it kind of, despite himself, he ended up teaching them and of course, falling in love with them. And the kids are really wonderful. The whole community is wonderful. He also loved music. And he was a singer. And he found that that community was a community of song. And they all liked to sing. And there was one woman kind of close to his age, I'm guessing, that had the best voice in the whole community. And when you listen to her sing, it was gorgeous. And he asked her to teach him to sing that song that she sang so beautifully. And she did. And there was nothing, there was not a hint of romance, or a very slight hint, if at all. But at the end, when he was going back to go to Australia, he'd done his year, and he did leave because the snow would come and he couldn't leave the village. He did leave. Do you remember he asked her, don't you want to leave? And you've got that voice. And don't you want to have the good life? And she says, no, I'm staying. And she said, my family, my community, I'm staying. So it was a spirituality of staying also for her. But then do you mind if I give it away? He went to Australia. So the last scene is him at a bar in Australia, in Sydney or someplace, playing his guitar and singing to all these folks that are kind of yuppies, drinking a little too much, bored to tears by his music. And he just stops there. And it's very awkward in that little bar. And then he remembers the song that she had taught him. And he sings that song in the bar. And it is gorgeous. And he did a good job. And so like Ellen sang, Ellen, I forgot at the end, did he decide to go back, or are we left wondering?
We don't know. We just know that the crowd stops talking and they're mesmerized by his song. And he seems so happy to be sharing the song. And then it's over. That's why I said, I wonder what happens next. My vision was that he did not stay there, that he went back to the happiest place on earth, which is what Bhutan is supposed to be.
Well, in the spiritual alphabet, M is for mystery, and I is for imagination. So we can put those together and think whatever we would like to think. I want to thank everybody for today, and we'll close out. And I want to also remind you that Lewis would like to receive your recommendations or suggestions for movies, and you can do this too.
I actually have a suggestion that we do the movie Frida, about Frida Kahlo's life. It's an excellent movie.
Send it to Lewis, okay? That's the key. All roads go to Lewis.
Yes, please email me with your movie suggestions. You can email me at the Interfaith Center at gmail.com, and we'll get those movies. We can go ahead and close out. I don't know if we want to close out with a closing prayer but I do have something for us. Feel free to leave anytime. We don't want to disrespect your time. But since Yom HaShoah is beginning tonight, I thought we could close out with a poem for this Holocaust Remembrance Day. So I've pulled up a poem by a Warsaw ghetto poet, MJ, no name on the poem. It's called A Funeral. The coffin, a crematorium furnace, lid transparent, made of air, human body turned into smoke, blown through the smokestack of history. How shall I honor your passing, walk in your funeral procession, you, homeless handful of ashes, between the earth and heaven? How to cast a green garland on the grave dug high in the air, an arc of the world's four corners under the invader's fire. Your coffin, which is not, will not slide from roaring cannons, and only the column of air illuminates your death with sun rays. And here is such a great silence on earth, like a trampled banner, in the morning smoke of corpses and a crucified outcry. So we'll end with that solemn remembrance of Holocaust Memorial Day. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone next week.
May I invite everyone to, since you brought that up,
yes.
Jay, for just 1 second. Jewish Federation of Arkansas is having a Yom HaShoah program tomorrow night. And if anyone would like to, who's local would like to come, it will be at the Agudas Achim Synagogue. But if you'd like to join us virtually, if you go to Jewish Federation of Arkansas, there'll be a link to the virtual Zoom call. And you know, we'd love to have anyone who's interested in participating in that way. Thank you.
Peace to all. Take care. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you, Jay.